Okay, well, hello everybody, and welcome to another presentation of the online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And in this edition of the Meetup, our 263rd, being recorded on Thursday, July 16th, 2020 at noon U.S. Eastern Time, we're going to have TJ VanToll speaking on what web developers can learn from native mobile developers. And I'll just throw a quick shout out that next week we'll have Alex Siskind on Introduction to NativeScript. So that'll get into some more specifics of a particular implementation, but this will be more generic. And thanks for coming on, TJ, and I'll go ahead and stop sharing.
Yeah, sounds good. So I will share my screen in just a second. And okay, I'm going to assume you can see this. If
Looks
you
good.
can't
Yep.
say if you can't see this, say rude things in the chat, and I'll figure it out. There we go. I got my chat button open. So yeah, thanks for the introduction. As I said, my name is TJ VanToll. I work as a developer advocate for a company called Progress, and I'll get into a little more about who I am and what I do throughout this talk. But the general concept is basically I'm going to cover a handful of things. First, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background. So this talk is about how people that work on the web can learn from people that are building basically native mobile apps. So I want to give you some context of why I care about this topic, some of the expertise I have in this topic, just sort of to set the stage for some tips that I have. So I basically have some things that I think that I've learned from working in an iOS and an Android environment that are things that can apply to web developers and really anybody that's building for the web sort of in any sort of tech stack whatsoever. And then we'll do questions. If you want to ask questions throughout this, I've got the chat client sort of thing up on my other monitor. So I'll be sort of monitoring that. So if you ask questions, I might answer some of these sort of in the flow. So feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'll chime in at the end. So there should be plenty of time here to handle any questions that you have. So I want to start with some background and sort of explain where I'm coming from. And the first thing I want you to know is that I am someone that has a huge background in the web, sort of from the very beginning. In fact, so far back, I found this picture of me in high school where, fun fact, I was 9 feet tall in high school, according to this picture. And in high school, being the very cool and popular kid that I was, I spent my free time in places like Angel Fire and GeoCities. So these are actual websites that I built. And I was that person that did the horrible animated GIFs, the autoplay music, the flash intros, all of those things that you think about the web, because I absolutely just sort of love do it. It's the thing that brought me into software development. And interestingly, something fun happened that the web got so popular that people would want to pay me to do these things, which was kind of fun. So a few years later, this is me again. I still have no hair. That was a weird decision at that age, but you can see I now was also still a basketball fan, but I was also now making money. This was now a career for me and not just a fun thing that I did in my free time. And I got like super into the web. I was a member of the jQuery UI team for a handful of years. I wrote a book on jQuery UI, which kind of funny. I was looking this up for this talk just because I wanted a screenshot, and I noticed that my 5-star rating had went away and that apparently Dragos was not a huge fan of the book, that they wish they hadn't bought it. So I lost my 5-star rating, but I still, the whole point of this sort of long winding story is I wanted to let you know that I am web in and out. That was sort of my life. I was passionate about the web. It's how I got to where I am today. I pretty much only have good things to say about the web. But an interesting thing happened probably about 6 years ago at this point. My boss at the time at Progress came to me and said, "Hey, TJ, are you interested in working on this new thing we have called NativeScript?" And NativeScript was interesting because to this point in my career, my background was 100% in the web, but NativeScript was a technology that helped developers build for iOS and Android. So platforms that were really completely foreign to me. But NativeScript did have a fun angle that you could use JavaScript to build for iOS and Android. So if you're familiar with React Native, NativeScript is a fairly sort of similar technology. All this to say that I've spent the last sort of 5 years working in an environment that before was pretty foreign to me, working with companies that build for iOS and Android, working in the, sort of the App Store and Google Play and the APIs that iOS and Android make available. And from that, I sort of have a few tips. So nowadays, you can't see my shirt, but I'm rocking a Kendo UI shirt. I've returned to the web, so I'm back working in sort of the environment that I've spent most of my career on. But because I spent so many years working in this iOS or an Android environment, it's sort of changed my perspective in how I approach web development in general. And the whole purpose of this talk and this background is to share some of these things because I'm hoping some of my experience can benefit you in what you're doing as well. And so I have 4 tips. And actually, there's a bonus 5th tip if you stick around. But I'm going to go through all these tips in details, but I'm just going to list them out first. So my first tip is that list scrolling performance is extremely important. This applies sort of regardless of whether you're building for the web or for native mobile. Testing on real devices matters. So physical devices are something you should have on hand. I'm going to encourage you to use animations, really subtle animations, more in the apps that you build, and minimizing asset downloads. So shipping as little code as possible in your web apps. And I'm not going to we'll go into details on each of these. And so we'll start with the one that I consider the most important. That's why it's on the top of the list. And it's that list scrolling performance is extremely important. And the reason I have this on the top is if you think about the apps that you use on your device, a whole giant chunk of these things are basically just lists. So think Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, chat apps like Discord, Slack, and I'll switch slides just so we don't get a seizure from watching this. But a lot of these native mobile apps are nothing more than giant lists. And if you think about it, and something that I've seen is that having lists that perform really well, and by that I mean you're holding the device in your hand, you scroll, it feels like a really smooth experience, you're getting new content right away. That's important both from just a UX usability perspective, like users like using apps that feel really natural and really good. But it's also important from a business perspective as well. If you think about, let's just take Facebook, for instance. Facebook wants you to see as much content as possible because they want you to interact with that content because they learn more about you as you interact. They also want you to see more content because they can show more ads and make more money. So it's in their best interest to make these lists feel as natural and smooth scrolling as possible. Now I switched to this slide because this is actually the first sort of sample app that I would show web developers that were coming over to NativeScript. And what I like about this example is the code for this, and don't worry about the details here because it's really not important. Other than this bit, I'm basically just casually throwing 100,000 items in a list and then just displaying that list on the page. So 20 some lines of code, and I have an app that can basically handle just 100,000 items in a list. And I like showing this because this usually blows web developers' minds because if you're not familiar, if you try to throw 100,000 DOM items in a list and try to run it, the browser is not super capable of making this happen. I'll show some examples of that in a second. But as you see, this renders crazy smooth on iOS and Android as well, and even on older devices. And the reason for that is not because we're doing some magic in NativeScript. It's because native mobile platforms, so iOS and Android, have built-in widgets to make these scrolling experiences really smooth and really polished. So for Android, this is the recycler view widget that's built into the platform. iOS has a UI table view. And these APIs are really, really good. This is actually the primary reason why lists on your phone are generally universally good. Native mobile apps, almost always when you scroll, it feels really smooth and it feels really natural, both on iOS and Android. And that's because the platforms have tools built into them to help you build those experiences. Now, meanwhile, on the web, as I said earlier, if you just sort of naively have a list and you write some code to say, like, let's just throw 100,000 items in that list and see what happens. So I tried this on I've got like a high-end iPhone 11, basically one of the better phones you can buy from a JavaScript processing point of view. And at first I thought this thing wasn't even going to load. So this is my list of 100,000 items. And it sat on the screen for a considerable amount of time. And it did eventually load, But you see that as I try to scroll this thing, it's janky. The browser is just not capable of handling this level of DOM abstraction. And this is on basically the nicest mobile phone that you can buy, at least among them. If I tried to load this on some of my older devices that I have sitting around for NativeScript testing, and some of them just refused to even participate in this experiment, they just sort of straight up crashed. But that doesn't mean you can't build really nice lists on the web. So for example, this is mobile.twitter.com, which is what I consider to be the best implementation of a really good list on the web. It's not quite as smooth as native. Sometimes things chunk in and are a little slow to load. But overall, this feels really good. And I encourage you to actually try this for yourself, especially if you are someone that exclusively, if you're a Twitter user that's only used it on your iOS or Android device natively, the mobile web app is actually quite good. And the reason for this is if you look at the implementation, what they're doing is as the user scrolls, instead of just constantly adding to the DOM, so we see in this GIF maybe 50, 60 tweets, but they're not creating a new div for each individual tweet. Instead, they're reusing a handful. So each div that appears in here represents one individual tweet. And they're reusing these to keep the DOM structure small so that it stays performant on mobile devices. And actually, there's a blog post here where this has this visualization that I really like. This area here is what the user is actually seeing. And the JavaScript behind the scenes is sort of maintaining these other ones that appear off the screen and managing them for you. So I've got a link to a write-up on here that I think is really good about how you can implement this sort of thing yourself. And I'll say, too, I have a link to the slides that I put at the very end. So just in case you missed some of these links, don't worry. We'll make sure you get a hold of them. But I think this is a good write-up on how to make this sort of thing possible. There are also other solutions that are framework specific. So for example, if you're building React apps, there's a plugin called React Window that gives you an implementation that you can use to do this sort of virtualization, handle the sort of messy JavaScript for you. As I said, I now work on the Kendo UI team at Progress. So we build UI components. We build UI components for jQuery, for Angular, for React. And we handle some of the virtualization for you in some of our widgets. So for example, this is our data grid. And you'll see that it can handle, I don't know how many we have in here, like I think 50,000 items. And we handle the messy sort of JavaScript for you. I have one final example, just because I think this was kind of funny that I ran into this when I was researching for this article. So this is Reddit, reddit.com. So we're on the web here. And one thing I thought was funny is that they list infinite scroll as basically a feature of their native app. So even Reddit, which probably has a bigger engineering team than whatever company you're working for, especially for the mobile web, even they sort of just gave up on implementing a performance scroll on the web. They just made it paging and said, like, hey, if you want infinite scroll, you had to head to the app. And they wanted you to go to the app so bad that they had 2 different calls to it. And this gets into like the business perspective of this. Reddit really wants you in the native app because they want the most performance scrolling performance possible so that they can show more content, so that they can show more ads and such. But you watching this, you don't necessarily have to be Reddit. If you are building mobile web apps that have lists and lists that are something sort of like a feed or a chat or a long list of content, I'd encourage you to look into some of these solutions that are available to make sure that your lists perform as smoothly as possible for your users, because it really does matter. That's sort of my tip in general. Performance is extremely important. And also, one of the things I want to get across as part of this talk is just being more cognizant of why the mobile landscape is what it is. The reason that native mobile apps feel better in terms of scrolling is that iOS and Android do all the work for developers, where on the web, we're sort of forced to use these sort of potentially janky JavaScript solutions to try to replicate what's built into iOS and Android. And there are proposals that I'm going to try to get involved with to bring some of this stuff natively to the web. It would be great if the browser could actually had like some sort of virtual list built into it so that you don't have to go through these steps, so that lists are by default performant on the web like they are on native. But for now, they're not. So it's just something to be aware of and to know that this performance is extremely important. All right, so that was my most important tip. Think about lists when you're building for the mobile web. it really is important. But another thing that's important is testing on real physical devices. And I am sort of guilty of not doing this as well. My testing workflow for mobile before I got involved with NativeScript was typically something like this. So I would take my site, I would open it up in the Chrome developer tools. So Chrome has this cool built-in thing where you can hit this mobile icon and you can get a sense of what your app looks like on a mobile device. So I do that. I then load up my app in sort of my whatever device I have. I'm a software developer. I usually have a pretty good mobile device. I'd make sure it looks good there. And if that's good, I would say, good enough. Ship it. Let's just get this thing out to production. And the problem with that is really it's a limited testing workflow. And I think there's two things that you're going to miss if you do something similar, if you don't have a more extensive mobile testing sort of workflow. The first is just straight up performance. So for example, this is a common JavaScript benchmarking tool called Jetstream 2. And basically in this one, bigger numbers are better. And it's just measuring how fast the browser can run straight up JavaScript. And you'll see that the desktop browsers, this is Chrome running on my MacBook Pro, gets like a 111. And modern mobile devices are actually quite powerful. So this is my new iPhone. It actually beats desktop Chrome, which I thought was kind of interesting. So if you're only testing on devices that are new and fancy and slick, you might miss that performance on older devices is really not that great. So I tried to run this on a variety of devices that I had laying around here from NativeScript. And some of them were getting scores in like the 20s and 30s. And some of them just straight up refused to run the test. Like this iPhone 5, it really did try. It gave a good effort at running this as like the little engine that could, but it totally gave up. And my point in bringing this up is that if you're not actually testing your apps on devices like this, devices that your users are using, you're going to miss out on the poor experience that some of your users are having. And there are some things that you can do about this. So I'll talk about the things I recommend. There is a performance section in the Chrome developer tools. And in this, there is a CPU option. So you can sort of simulate a slow network and also just slow CPUs. Because when you're testing your mobile app out on essentially a desktop simulator, this is running the CPU that's built into your your MacBook Pro or your Surface or your Windows PC, which is going to be a whole lot faster in general than your average user's mobile device. So this can be used to help simulate a slowdown. But I prefer just to not use this. I don't like using sort of simulators. I like to be on the metal, I guess, or to have the actual devices that my users are using physically in my hand. Both because I think it's important to feel the performance difference. So feel like if you're waiting for something to load in and you're trying to click buttons and that gets frustrating, it's important to actually have that in your hand. And the other thing is when you're testing on physical devices, you tend to catch little UX things that are going to bother the hell out of your users. And I think everybody has, and I want you to think about this as well. Do you have a pet peeve about using the mobile web? Because almost everybody I talk to, and you can throw this in the chat as well, everybody has some pet peeve about using the mobile web on their device. That's something that just never works. Now, I have two of them, and I'll show you them. The first is this stupid mobile banner that almost all popular apps use. So this is Reddit's way of plugging, they want you to open download their mobile app. But the problem is, apps never account for the layout change that happens because of this. So you can see on Reddit, this little banner is supposed to be showing, but it gets blocked because this thing is essentially pushing it off the page. And nothing ever accounts for this. So this is on Twitter. Twitter has this banner as well. And when you try to share a tweet, which is what I'm doing in this GIF, it sort of hides the cancel button because it doesn't account for this. And it gets janky when you try to scroll to see it. And it's all a bit messy. And this is like Twitter and Reddit, right? You expect if anybody's good at the mobile web and handling it, it would be them. So that's my first pet peeve. Nobody on iOS web accounts for this stupid banner. My other one is tap targets that are way too small. So this is CNN, and I tried to hit this thing, and I swear I was tapping on this thing like an absolute maniac, and the menu would not pop up. So I dug into it and found that this stupid little icon is 24 by 24 pixels, and they don't give you space around it to actually tap this thing. And I see you got a chat. Do you have any recommendations on what devices to have on hand for testing? Yeah, so that's a great leading question. Any recommendations on brands and models? That's perfect. So I'm going to get into this in another slide or two. So this is the other thing that bothers me, like small tap targets. So 24 by 24. I was on Discord and I was also trying to hit this stupid thing. And you see, like, it looks like the tap target is bigger. But when I run this, you see every time this flickers is when I'm trying to hit this thing. And I have like a 33% success rate. Like sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And I have absolutely no idea why. And there are recommendations about this. So like, for example, Apple recommends minimum touch targets of 44 by 44 pixels. And that's pretty good. It's pretty damning of CNN's 24 by 24 little drawer icon because it's basically half of that. But my advice is all of this, like, I swear if the Discord people or the CNN people or the Reddit people or the Twitter people would have been testing this on real devices, there's no way they could have missed this. Like, you find these things in a second and it's going to irritate the crap out of you. Now, to get into your question, because I think this is a good one, like recommendations for specific devices to have, I'm not recommending that you have like a full mobile testing library and suite. This is actually from the NativeScript team. This was in our office, and this was one of the set of devices we have. And because we were building a framework, we really had to have every device out there, right? Because we had to support all of these things. But for you probably don't need all of this. So I have actually a set of sort of pragmatic advice that's going to depend on what it is you're building. So for first thing, I would say to check your analytics to see what users right now are trying to use your site in. And because this can vary and this can surprise you quite a bit. So Google Analytics, if you're using that, they have a sort of mobile testing section that can break down what mobile devices are commonly being used. So I ran this on a couple different sites that I have access to analytics on. And this is from our Progress blog. And you'll see that for this one, at least, we have a surprising number of Microsoft tablets that are accessing our site. And this is because we have a background in the Windows space. So we have a number of, our audiences tends to be more enthusiastic Windows users more than your average population. But this means that if I'm the person that's sort of designing how the blog on Progress works, I'm probably going to want to test out and have a Microsoft tablet handy because I want to make sure these users that are trying to access this have a pretty good experience. On another site, this is, I maintain a site for standard poodles because I'm a very cultured man. And interestingly, looking at the analytics, the Venn diagram between people that are interested in standard poodles and people that like Apple devices and iOS devices, there's a ton of overlap there. So when I'm testing out this site, I probably want to have iOS devices on hand, or at least make sure those are my focus of what I'm building on. And maybe you see I got a number of Samsung devices. This would also be a good candidate because it's also another common device type that's there. So my next step would be check your analytics and identify a few popular devices. Ideally, you want to have both platforms covered, so iOS and Android. I'd like to have one high-end device for both, like a really nice iOS device, a really nice Android device. And oftentimes, too, you can use personal devices because software developers tend to have sort of the latest and greatest. So you can use devices that you already have on hand and maybe acquire one slightly older iOS and Android device, especially an older device that you see in your analytics coming up quite a bit. And then I'd encourage you to buy these things. So what I did all the time for NativeScript is I just went to eBay and searched for these things. And the great thing about devices for just these sort of casual testing things is that it's totally cool if you get like a used one, a refurbished one. It's actually probably better if you get something that's used or refurbished because it's more accurately reflecting the user experience. And you can get these things for relatively cheap, at least compared to sort of acquiring a totally brand new device. And I'd also encourage you to, if you are buying these devices and you're, say, working for a company, especially a bigger company, lots of times there can be red tape in place. I know I've worked for corporate environments where you, they pay developers a whole lot and then put a bunch of hurdles or barriers in front of spending $100 on some stupid thing. But I'd encourage you to fight against that red tape. I really do think it's important to find a way to get a few of these devices around. How much you need really depends on how important mobile is to what you're building. And this sort of leads into my last step of testing. If you're building on the far end of the spectrum, if you're building mobile.twitter.com, you probably want to have quite a few devices, and you probably want to test your apps on those devices pretty regularly, at the very least every release or every sort of check-in in code. But on the flip side of thing, if mobile is just something that you don't get a lot of activity, it's not super important to your strategy, then maybe just having one or two older devices and testing it just really periodically is going to be sufficient. So you sort of have to find the line depending on how much you're doing mobile and how important that is to your businesses or your strategies and whatnot. But I do think it's important. That's why I listed it on this, because personally I found there's a huge difference. And I saw the same thing for native app development as well, by the way. The iOS simulator and like Android AVDs and emulators are pretty good, but they're using the CPU that's built into your laptop. And especially with older devices, it's totally different trying it out for yourself. Using your apps with your fingers just feels different. You can catch all these small little UX things in addition to the performance things. So that's the tip in general. Testing on real devices matters just in general. Hopefully some of that you can find useful and apply to your own workflows and experiences. All right, so we've done list scrolling and performance is extremely important. We've talked about testing on real devices, why they matter. The third tip on my list is I'm going to encourage you to use animations more. And I found this quote. So this is from the Jacob Nielsen's. They have a group that's pretty popular name in the sort of UX space. And there's a blog post here that you can read that goes into more detail. But I like this quote just because I think it sort of summarizes my point. And the quote is basically, when UI animations are subtle, unobtrusive, and brief, they can improve the user experience and can communicate feedback and state changes, do things like prevent disorientation and strengthen signifiers. It's a long way of saying when I like to summarize this as when UI animations are subtle, they can improve the user experience. These little things that these apps do can really help. And for the context of this talk, the reason I'm bringing this up is I found that for whatever reason, native apps are far more likely to implement these sort of animations. And I've got a few examples. So this is the Twitter native iOS app. And I'm actually going to restart this. I'm playing this in slow motion. And what I'm doing is I'm going to hit this button down here. And notice how there's this subtle little press animation on the button to give the user feedback that this button was clicked. You get this nice little slide up animation. And again, this is slowed down. So in real time, this feels really smooth. It doesn't get in the user's way at all. You can type basically instantly. And I'm going to hit cancel in a minute. And you see I also get this smooth experience where it returns down to the screen, sort of indicates where the UI is coming from. And it feels really natural and really nice. It really is quite pleasant to use, and it sort of teaches you the UI and gives you feedback. So this is mobile.twitter.com, and I'm going to do the same thing. And I'll start this over real quick. Sorry if this is a little bit disorienting. But you can see they ditched the button animation. And when this little thing slides up, it's super, super janky. Like this stupid banner that I'm going to complain about like 3 more times, like leaves and comes back in. There's also this thing, if you watch closely, like there's this UI in the bottom of the screen that like chunks in and then goes away for absolutely no reason. And the whole thing feels jarring. So instead of being this nice, subtle animation that guides the user through the UI and shows them what they're going to be doing, this, in my opinion, is confusing as hell and not the greatest user experience. And I have tons of examples of this. So on one of my favorite animations that native apps do, so this is YouTube on my iOS device. And this, by the way, works the same on Android as well. But if you're watching a video and you want to multitask, like you want to see something else, you can slide the video down and it appears on the bottom of the screen. And it's super nice. It's smooth. It's great for the user because the video shows down there. It sort of indicates where the video goes. Now you know where to go when you get it back, but you have the ability to use the rest of the UI. Twitch does this as well. A lot of other video apps do this sort of thing also. Now, if you go to YouTube on the web, not only can you not do that, but you get this weird experience, this stupid banner. I think I've got 2 more complaints left. Just randomly shows up. Why is that showing up now? I have no idea. But the whole thing feels janky rather than this smooth experience. And I think what frustrates me about this the most is that there's no reason this should be in place. So when I talked about lists, for example, lists feel better on native because native developers have an advantage. They have APIs that are built in to make these things really great. But the web is totally capable of playing ball with native in terms of animation performance. So I wanted to show you at least one positive example on the web. So this is another animation that I really like. This is the Photos app on iOS. And as I start using this, I love this. The photos basically pop up and then you can slide them back in. And it's really the best of an animation that helps the user because by like returning to the spot it came from, it helps give you context of where you are in the UI. And to Apple's credit, if you go to iCloud.com, they replicated basically the exact same thing. You tap on a photo, you can bring it down, the UI stays and it maintains all of this, and it feels really smooth. And I know a lot of this is iOS focused, but I should give Google some props as well because Google Photos and also photos.google.com do the same thing. Apple and Google tend to steal good ideas from each other all the time, so I don't know who came first. But Google's implementation of this is actually also really good. Photos.google.com is really elegant to use both natively and on the web as well, so they did a good job with this as well. And in terms of specifics, I don't have a lot, and just because I don't come from a design background, so I don't have specific recommendations in terms of you should totally do this specific thing because it's going to depend on what you're building. I do have one recommendation. There's a library that's really popular amongst native developers called Lottie, and it's something that you can use in your web apps as well. And essentially, these are tiny little animations. You've probably seen animations that look like this. And they're implemented in a kind of unique way. You bring these things in as JSON files, and then there's a little bit of JavaScript that runs these animations. And they're really sort of subtle things that you can add, but they feel really nice. I'll just restart this so you can see one more time to make your app feel more alive, more active, more usable as well. So Lottie's one recommendation. If you're looking for just sort of ideas and inspiration, it's one thing to check out. Really, I would just encourage you to just be cognizant as you're using iOS and Android, as you're in applications, just pay attention to the animations you like and try to bring some of this stuff to the web. But I do have to include one disclaimer in here. So this is the same quote I showed earlier, so nothing to read here. But there's one sentence that comes after this that says, but they should not be, they is animations here. Animations should not be overused as they could easily become overwhelming and distract users. So if you think about it for a while, you've probably all used that native app where the developer really drank the animation Kool-Aid and went over the top and things are flying and buzzing all around the place. And you don't want to be that person either. So you want to look for these little subtle things that are quite nice, like some of the examples that I showed earlier, and try to bring these things to the web. Now, on that note, I have one final point that falls under this umbrella of sort of animations. And this one's kind of potentially a little bit controversial, is sound. So at some point, it was decreed, I don't know who the web gods are, but somebody decreed that sound is 100% off limits for the web. Like I think people have flashbacks of horrible flash intros and auto playing music and just decided the web shall not have sound in any way, unless maybe you're like a game. That's like the only exception for what you could do sound on the web. But native apps don't have this restriction. And actually, so you're not seeing me in my device, but I'm going to try. We'll see how well I can put this up. I'm going to put this right next to the mic. You may hear this or you may not. But when you pull to refresh, like in Twitter, for example, let me crank up the volume. I don't know if you'll hear it or not, but we're going to give it a shot. I don't think so. Oh, no, because I have this here. This is, we'll get this to work. So I have no idea if you heard this. However, Twitter, too much, I'm not sure, Forrest, what you're saying. Too much, I'm not sure. But basically, Twitter does sounds for pull to refresh. There's a number, even like the native Facebook app. We didn't hear, to be clear. Gotcha. Well, I'd encourage you to just be aware of how much sound native apps do use. Like for pull to refresh, both Twitter and Facebook play this little sound that like pull and pop that gives you an indication of when data is done loading. Facebook even shows sounds when you press buttons, which I actually kind of like. I know it's not for everyone. So my point here is don't think of sound as off limits for the web, because native app developers don't think that way either. There are times where sounds can actually be really nice. For example, if notification comes in, maybe you play a little bing or a dot or something. If the user tries to interact with something that's disabled, you have a button that they can't click and they try to click it anyways, a little sound that says, or something that just really indicates to the user that, hey, you shouldn't be doing this, might be a good idea. So I have one blog post that I'll recommend, and again, I'll share the slides later so that you can find this. A friend of mine, Brian Rinaldi, has a write-up on this where he basically encourages web developers to at least consider sound, because it shouldn't be, we don't want to go back to the days, like I don't want you to be playing, auto-playing some Linkin Park music when people come to your site, but little things here and there, I would argue, can actually enhance the user experience as they use your apps. And don't think of sound as off limits. So that's my tip. Just be aware of the animations that native apps use. And as you're building things for the web, think about how you can implement these things a little bit more, because for whatever reason, native apps currently are doing these sort of animations a lot more than web apps are doing. All right, so how are we doing? We have 24 minutes left. This is perfect because we are on to our last tip. We've talked about list scrolling experience. We've talked about real devices, testing real devices matter, settled animations. My last tip is to minimize asset downloads. And this tip is probably the least sort of original or unique tip I have on my list, because if you Google web performance top tips, probably the number one thing on that list is going to be ship less code, or reduce the amount of JavaScript, CSS you're using, and whatnot. It's a pretty common web performance best practice. But for this talk, I'm bringing this up in a slightly different context. And it gets into the difference between just how native apps and web apps work. Because when native apps load, so think about when you tap the Facebook icon on your phone, that Facebook app, it's going to have all the codes and assets it needs. So it got it all from the App Store. So when Facebook loads, it will need to hit the network to load data. Like it needs to know the ads it's going to show, the things it's going to show in the feeds, what your friends have been up to and whatnot. But Facebook doesn't have to hit the network to load the app code itself. The code to show the menus, the buttons, it's all there. It's already been compiled and processed, and it's ready to go. And this represents an absolutely enormous advantage for native apps. When you talk about the performance difference between native apps and web apps, I believe this is the overwhelming reason why native apps are perceived to be more performant, because they don't have to hit the network to get the app code itself and to interpret it, which web apps absolutely have to do. So to see an example of this in action, I have the ESPN app, which I freshly downloaded and installed on this iPhone. And when I start it up, notice how there is a bit of a delay for getting this content. ESPN needs to tell me about the MLB season coming back. But the stuff, like, I'll play it one more time, the menus and stuff, all of this is just there instantaneously because it didn't have to go to the network to get the code to run this. And meanwhile, if you try to run ESPN.com on the web, so this is a web browser, completely empty cache and such, and I try to load this, on my high-end iPhone, this comes in, like, there's a 3-4 second delay, but it comes in relatively fast. You see there's a second delay for getting the images and for getting this. But that delay is because ESPN has no choice. It's just the architecture of the web to go to the network to actually get this content. And this, by the way, is still like a best case scenario. So this is a high-end mobile device. I'm on Wi-Fi, really good Wi-Fi to load this. So I tried just to give it an example of what maybe a more common user experience might be on a lower end device. So this is an iPhone, I think this is an iPhone 5, somewhere in that space. And when I try to load ESPN.com on here, you'll see that it takes like a good, probably like 8 or 9 seconds before it does anything. And then it's got the content, it's got some of the menus, but then there's a second delay. You'll see the images pop in. Oops, I killed my video, but there's a second delay before the images and the video pop in and such as well, which is just due to the architecture of the web. Now, I'm not going to go in. We don't have time to get into a full list of, say, performance best practices. I've included a few links to some of my favorites about getting up to speed. Google has a lot of really good content on this about why performance matters. how to implement caching so that you don't have to go to the network as often. Lighthouse is a really good tool that's available to help you sort of measure your performance and come up with ways that you can potentially optimize your code. The thing that I want you to be aware of, and the reason I brought this up in my tips, is that if you are building for the mobile web and you get tasks like your boss says, like, hey, the iOS people have their app starting up in like 0.5 seconds and we have to match this, you have to realize you're operating at a disadvantage on the web. It's like you're running a 400-meter race, right? Like a one lap around the track. And your opponent, the dude and the gal in the iOS and Android shirts, they're starting like all the way up the straightaway, right? They've got like a 100-meter head start on you because of the nature of the platform. iOS and Android have all this stuff. And on the web, if you want to fight against this, you have to go through all these steps to try to compete. So it's just more an FYI than anything else. And this stuff does matter because the faster you can get your app to load up, it's better from not only usability perspective. Obviously, users like to see stuff as fast as possible, but it's also important from a business perspective. The faster users go in, the faster they're going to interact with your site. They're going to do things, they're going to convert, they're going to do all the businessy terms that you want to do as well. So hopefully that makes sense. Really, I'm just trying to present almost like a different perspective. If you think about the mobile web with some context of how native mobile works, I think you start to see things a little bit differently. Things like list scrolling performance is important, and native makes it super easy for developers by providing APIs that are built in. And on the web, you sort of have to fight against that. That testing on real devices matters. I think a lot of web developers test mostly on simulators on the web, and having the app in your hand helps you find some of these performance issues that your app might have, as well as UX issues like not being able to hit a button or that stupid iOS banner that I think that's the last time I'm going to complain about. Tip 3 was to use subtle animations more. I really would encourage you to just pay attention. If you're like me and use your phone way more than you actually should, and you have way more apps than you actually should, just sort of look at what they're doing. What animations do you like? Which ones are annoying? Are there ones that you can bring to the apps that you're building and replicate the same? The web is a very capable platform nowadays. You can do super cool things with animations. So think about how you can implement these into your workflows. And finally, minimizing asset downloads. So just know that native apps have a head start with this. They're packaging all their code up. They have it all available. And if you want to replicate this for your users, you have to be really smart about how you cache, that you ship as little code as possible to try to sort of compete to what native has out of the box. All right, so hopefully that helps. Hopefully you found that interesting. Because you've been a great audience, though, I have one super special bonus tip. This is exclusive content just for you. This is unfortunately not a very unique or interesting tip. I wish I had something that was going to change your life. That would be great. I'd probably make a lot of money. But my tip is just to try iOS or Android development if you haven't done it before. You don't have to do what I did and spend 5 years of your career doing this to gain these sort of insights. I think you can really gain it by just trying to build out a simple application. I know for me, it was a grocery list. Basically, I needed a grocery list app. I didn't like any of the ones that were out there. I decided, hell with it. I'm going to try to build one of these things myself. And that's where I first got to see how lists work differently and how much more I enjoyed that experience. Native is not all good. I focused on the good things because I think that's the things I want web developers to learn the best of native. You also learn some of the pain of native because native is tricky in many respects to get up and running. But you won't know that unless you try it. And this is similar to tips like try new programming languages, which is probably something that you've heard before to expand your horizons. The same sort of thing applies to platforms. You try different platforms, you start to see the things you build and the way you work from a totally different angle. And it can just sort of expand your horizons and such. So I'd encourage you to try it out. It doesn't matter which platform. If you're an iOS person, congratulations, you've made the right choice, and I will fight you later. Otherwise, just kidding. I like Android too, but I do prefer iOS. So iOS, Android, Xcode, if you're that sort of person, if you drank the Apple Kool-Aid like I've had and went down the deep end, that's great. Android's a great platform as well. If you have an Android device, you're using Android Studio, that's great to build for as well. It's totally an interesting experience. It doesn't matter which. I just encourage you to sort of tinker, build something. It can really change the way that you approach software development in general. So those are my tips. I said 40 minutes. I think we're 45 minutes in, so I'm pretty good at estimating. Does anybody have any additional questions, anything to chat about, anything else, because that is the end. I have a link to my slides here that you can take a picture of. I'm pretty sure we'll make it available afterwards in some context if you want to get a hold of it as well. So if you do want to track down any of those links, those will be available. But at this point, basically open floor to any questions anybody might have.
And while we wait for them to type those in, first, thanks, TJ. Second, folks, if you're watching, you can see that now there's a set of polls on the right. If you'll take a moment to fill that out too while you're watching the conversation. And then three, TJ, if you grab that URL from your slide and pop it in as a chat, it becomes a hyperlink. And you can put your Twitter link there as well. I don't think it turns that into one, but it'll be enough for people.
Yep, I will do that right now. And I think the slides look weird. It links to Dropbox. It looks weird in Dropbox, but if you download it and run PowerPoint natively, it'll look all right. So there are the slides. I'll toss in the Twitter as well. All right, so I see one question. What's a good place to start if you wanted to build your first Android app? So Android, if you just so downloading Android Studio would be a good first place to go. And there's going to be links in there for documentation and stuff on how to get started and what to build with. I would say I always encourage people to build something that you actually find useful. So and this just depends on you. Like everybody has a different way that they learn best. But for me, I learn if I actually have a problem that I want to solve. Like in my case, it was a grocery list. I built stupid apps for like Pokemon that are out on the App Store that you can find if you're bored. But like they're trying to solve real problems that I have helps me learn more than just some sort of contrived example. But Android Studio, Google, it'll link to the Google documentation for that. That's what I'd encourage you to start off with. Yeah, and then Adobe Flex used the same approach to list, reusing list items to not waste memory. Yeah, a lot of platforms have some of the things built in. It's sort of unfortunate that the web doesn't, and I mean, maybe it will someday. There actually are, I've seen there's some like experimental proposals to build something like this into browsers, but as best I can tell, it's like experimental. There's no real push to actually implement it. So I know it's being talked about, but yeah. Question from Forrest: no way to leverage native app libraries in web apps due to security, right? Yeah, you can't access native stuff. And actually, what I found is that a lot of people that came to like NativeScript were web developers that needed like one thing from the native platforms that they couldn't get from the web. Like, for example, one example I like to use a lot is if you use banking apps, one thing you can do is like scan checks. So if you've never done this, it's like magic. You use your camera, you point it at a check, it pulls things out and it uses it. You can't really do that on the web because like your E-Trade or your Citi or your Chase or whatever mobile app you're doing needs to do a little bit more with like the camera APIs to make that possible. So like little things like that, if you need to go beyond the scope of what the web can do, you sort of have to look to mobile. I should also, I mean, I could do a plug for NativeScript as well. NativeScript's kind of a fun way of approaching native because you still get to write JavaScript code if that's something you're familiar with, but you do have access to sort of native APIs and such. So libraries like NativeScript can be nice, making the learning curve a little bit easier than going like all in native. Yeah, and Dan just gave the plug that I did. NativeScript's pretty cool. I'm still a big... Yeah. Oh, and yes, show up next week and you'll get an intro to it. I'm still a big fan. I'm not involved with it personally anymore, but I'm a proud, I recommend it heavily.
Proud alum.
Exactly. I still have the shirts. The shirts were really good. I miss the shirts. I need to get more of those. I also have a bunch of NativeScript stress cubes around that I used to take to conferences, and I got like one box of them. And then I stopped doing NativeScript stuff, and now I have a box of NativeScript stress cubes, and I'm not sure what I'm going to do with them in my life, but I have them, just in case. Any other questions? I think that was all that came in. Anything else you want to know? Dave is typing. Favorite Pokemon? Oh, this is a tough question. So historically, it was Charizard, which I know is a fairly common pick and kind of boring. But I do like Charizard. I actually, so I'm gonna go in the weeds here. This is great content. But if you've played the latest Pokemon games, Caparaja is an elephant Pokemon, and it's pretty sweet. And I think I'm gonna link it up in the chat because I'm a big fan of elephants. So I am a Caparaja fan. A link is going in the chat because this is very important for you all to know. So you need to be a Caparaja supporter as well. All right, any other questions? I guess last call.
And if
I think
there
that
aren't
might be.
any, I'll just point out that somebody may be waiting to ask one off the recording if they don't want to do it in a way that's recorded. So I'll go ahead and stop the recording and we'll hang out and see if anybody has any questions after that. And so
All right,
thanks again,
sounds good.
TJ, for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for
And
having
it's a
me.
great intro to the talk, a lead in to the talk next week on intro to NativeScript. So come on back for that, folks, and go to the ColdFusionMeetup.com to find out more about that. Yes. Join Dan in a round of applause. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.